Hi, my name is Mariana Vallejo, and I am a PhD student and project assistant at the Department of Geography and Regional Research at the University of Vienna. This video presents a continuation of our research on the spatial crime perception gap. It follows the previous video, Are Places Where People Feel Unsafe Actually Unsafe? Now, in this second study, we explore how characteristics of the urban environment are associated with different types of perception accuracy. This is the methodology we followed. First, we analyze people's perception of safety. Then we examine recorded crimes incidents and reference data. Finally, we compare both datasets to identify areas where perception and recorded crimes patterns align or diverge. Before exploring the urban characteristics, let me briefly summarize how we identify the spatial crime perception gap, since these results provide the input for the following analysis. We collected people's safety perception through an online geo-questionnaire in which participants drew polygons on a base map to indicate areas they perceive as safe or unsafe. For the data processing, we transform the polygons into grid cells and apply a binomial test to identify statistically significant areas collectively perceived as safe or unsafe. For the recorded crime data, we analyzed geocoded crime incidents and aggregated them into the same grid cells. We then perform a local spatial autocorrelation analysis using local Moran's I to identify statistically significant crime hot and cold spots. Next, we compare safety perception with the reference data represented by crime hot and cold spots. We classified each grid using the spatial crime perception gap matrix, which defines the 4 types of perception accuracy. The final results show the spatial distribution of these 4 perception types. After identifying the spatial crime perception gap, the objective of the second study was to investigate how urban environmental characteristics are associated with different types of perception accuracy. Our first objective was to identify the urban environmental characteristics associated with the places perceived as safe or unsafe. Our second objective was to assess whether specific urban characteristics are linked to the perception gap. After sketching an area, participants selected positive or negative urban characteristics from a predefined list that best described the market areas. For example, they could select illuminated or poorly illuminated streets, the presence or absence of surveillance measures, and well-maintained or inadequately maintained surroundings. We examined 7 characteristics: illumination, surveillance elements, maintenance of surroundings and maintenance of infrastructure, noise levels, general safety perception, and social concerns. Participants' responses were aggregated to determine the dominant perception in each safe or unsafe area. We defined a level of agreement scale based on the proportion of positive and negative responses for each urban characteristic. Depending on the proportion supporting the dominant perception, agreement was classified from weak to strong. Here we have a set of 2 maps for Vienna, showing areas perceived as safe and unsafe. They show levels of agreement regarding positive and negative public lighting conditions. In Vienna, the map shows moderate to strong agreement that perceived safe areas have good lighting conditions. In perceived unsafe areas, participants generally agreed that light was inadequate, although the strength of agreement varied. We observe a similar pattern in Budapest. For surveillance, Vienna shows strong agreement regarding the presence of surveillance elements in perceived safe areas and their absence in perceived unsafe areas. In Budapest, agreement in perceived safe areas is more variable, with surveillance presence in some areas and absent in others. In perceived unsafe areas, however, there is a strong agreement regarding the absence of surveillance elements. For the maintenance of surroundings and infrastructure, we observed a similar pattern in both cities. Areas perceived as safe were generally considered well maintained, while areas perceived as unsafe were associated with poor maintenance. Now let us examine these results across the 4 perception accuracy types. Here we again use the Spatial Crime Perception Matrix, which compares perception with the reference crime data. Let me first explain how to interpret the figures. The horizontal axis represents the level of agreement, while the vertical axis shows the positive and negative forms of each urban characteristics. These figures are similar to the previous maps, but here we see the number and percentage of hexagonal cells assigned to each agreement level. This example shows areas accurately perceived as safe. For most urban characteristics, the majority of cells show strong agreement on positive conditions. Noise levels are the main exception as the agreement is more dispersed. When we examine the 4 perception accuracy types in Vienna, we see that areas perceived as safe are generally associated with positive urban characteristics. Areas perceived as unsafe are associated with negative urban characteristics, although their level of agreement are more dispersed. Budapest shows the same general pattern. Areas perceived as safe are associated with positive urban characteristics, while areas perceived as unsafe are associated with negative characteristics. However, the strength of agreement varies across characteristics and perception accuracy types. As a final step, we conducted a field assessment of the perceived urban characteristics and compared participants' responses with observable conditions. We visited the most frequently identified by participants as inaccurately safe or inaccurately unsafe based on the highest number of overlapping polygons. The aim was to assess whether participants' perception of urban characteristics corresponded with field observations. Here we show maps for 3 urban characteristics: illumination, maintenance of surroundings, and maintenance of infrastructure. Using the Q-Field application, we mapped features such as poor lighting, graffiti, overgrown vegetation, litter, and poorly maintained roads, buildings, and parks. The field assessment generally captured conditions similar to those reported by participants. In conclusion, perceived safety and unsafety show spatial patterns similar to lighting, maintenance, cleanliness, visible disorder, active use, and guardianship. Unsafe areas perceived as safe are associated with positive perception of the urban environment. In contrast, safe areas perceived as unsafe are associated with negative perception of the urban environment. Unlike the crime perception gap, perception of urban environmental characteristics broadly correspond with field observations. The findings suggest that safety perception emerged from the accumulative interpretation of urban characteristics, although further inferential analysis is required. Thank you for watching this video on the spatial crime perception gap and urban environmental characteristics. To learn more about the topic and the work of the Digital Geography Working Group, please see the description below.